Hello, everyone. So in this section, we're going to talk about the proactive SCI coaching, essentially the nuts and bolts of how it works. So as a bit of an overview of the different components of the proactive SCI, we essentially have three key components here. So there's education. So what is physical activity? How do we do it? What are the physical activity guidelines? And what are some of the things that we should know about to support sustained participation? Linking and referral to other programs, peers, and organizations. And then thirdly, how to develop an exercise prescription, which might not be appropriate for all deliverers. So let's start and go through each of these components. But first, recognizing that we essentially have two layers to help you think through these different components. There's lots of information there. And the first layer is your physical activity coaching form. And so this form is used to help guide that physical activity coaching conversation and gives you the high-level overview of each of these components. And then you can use layer 2, which is the full proactive SCI toolkit, if you need more information on how to fill in the blanks within those conversation pieces. So let's start with education here around what are we actually talking about? What is physical activity? And for our purposes, we focus largely on leisure time physical activity. So leisure time physical activity, it's the activity that you choose to do in your free time. And it can be all kinds of things, like wheeling for fun or for fitness. It could be sports, it could be strength training, it could be hiking, what have you. Now, where the gray area comes in here is that rehab exercises, they might also have this overlapping goal in aligning with aerobic strength and fitness. However, our focus for the proactive SCI is not on rehabilitative exercises, but thinking more broad scope of these activities that you choose to do in your free time, okay? So an important piece of this information are the spinal cord injury physical activity guidelines. And one thing to note with the guidelines is that just because we have guidelines doesn't mean that it's a place where we need to start. And the really beautiful thing about the spinal cord injury specific physical activity guidelines is what's unique from, say, for example, the 24-hour movement guidelines is they provide a minimum threshold for what we need to see for the starting level. Where we can achieve fitness benefits, and at the advanced level where we can see cardiometabolic health benefits. So things like helping to prevent or reduce our risk for things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, lots of those challenging diseases that many people with spinal cord injury are at increased risk for. So at the starting level, the recommendation is to do twice a week, at least 20 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. And so that means that you'd be able to talk but not sing a song, and then strength training twice a week. And then at the advanced level, so the minimum that we'd need to achieve to see cardiometabolic health benefits, we would increase that to 3 times a week, 30 minutes, again, that moderate to vigorous intensity, and maintaining that strength training at least twice a week. So goals that we can set as benchmarks, either for a place to start or a place to aim for down the road. And as we come to achieve those benchmarks, we can work towards exceeding them. Now, an important conversation here I mentioned about, being able to talk but not sing a song. I think one of the most challenging components of education in physical activity and prescribing in particular is this concept of intensity, or how hard we're working. So these are some of the ways in which we can have that intensity conversation. So there's the talk test. Mild intensity would be you're able to talk and sing a song. Moderate intensity, you're able to talk but not sing a song. And then that vigorous intensity, you're definitely not singing a song. And if you are talking, you are needing to pause for a breath every few words. So that's one way, talk test. Another way is using a numerical scale. So an example might be the Omni scale or the CR10. In any case, those scales range from 1 to 10. And you can see here in this specific example, Moderate intensity is somewhere between that 4 to 6 range. Moderate to vigorous, the threshold in between those two levels is around a 7 to 8, and vigorous intensity would range to about a 9 or 10 out of 10. Now, there's some other descriptors here that can also be helpful, looking at how we feel in terms of our muscles, how we're breathing, how our skin might feel, and some nuances in that not everyone will experience sweating. So looking for some other indicators of how hard we're focusing as well might be a good way to describe intensity. And most of these have been developed and used for measuring aerobic activity. But when we're talking about strength training, I find it helpful to use things like reps in reserve, or having a sense of how many reps you have left in the tank. So if we have someone who finishes their set, let's say they had 10 repetitions in a set, and they felt like they could still do a few more reps at the end of the set, but they certainly couldn't keep going forever. Maybe that's that moderate intensity and vigorous intensity. You're just at the end point there where maybe you had 1, maybe 2 repetitions left in the tank before either you're unable to complete further reps with perfect form, or you're getting to that point of having to stop because we can't complete the repetition. So that's, to give us a bit of a benchmark for how hard maybe we want to push ourselves if today is a good day. Okay, so now we'll take a moment here to have a little bit of a discussion. So where we can move from here, now we have a sense of what physical activity is. We want to, before engaging in this conversation, see if this is something that our client wants to talk about in the first place. So I like to start with this question about, are we interested in being physically active or moving your body? And we have the yes, the pro seed model, and no, the plant seed model. So we'll start with this needing to plant the seed, where maybe if someone isn't interested in talking about physical activity at this time, ask if they're interested to share a little bit about why that's the case for them. And in that case, you might be able to then address some of the barriers that they may be experiencing. It might be an opportunity to talk about some of the benefits of physical activity if that's something that they might be interested to explore. But really important is to make those benefits relevant to who they are and what's important to them. So for example, why is getting stronger something that might be important to them? Well, maybe it, allows them to maintain their independence or to be able to play with their kids. Now, if you got the yes and you said, yeah, we're here to talk about physical activity, great, we can move towards the ProACTIVE model. And we can start talking about all these fun things around what you're currently doing for physical activity, what you'd like to do, how you'd like to do it, what you have available to you, some of the things that might get in the way, and how we might put together a plan to move forward. So starting with an understanding of what you're currently doing for physical activity, it can be helpful to, first off, when asking that question, to acknowledge that, if it's nothing, that's okay. And they're not alone. And that's the case for many people living with spinal cord injury, is that we are either not meeting the physical activity guidelines. There are lots of challenges for why physical activity is really hard, and especially to get started. So just to couch that consideration. So when we're having that discussion, helpful to know if they are doing physical activity, how often they're doing it. So how many times a week, what is it that they're doing, and for how long and at what intensity are we currently seeing their physical activity. And then you might want to bridge that into what their goals are. So given what you're currently doing, what would you like to do for physical activity? How much would you like to do? How often? What is it that you would like to do for physical activity? But a key point to highlight here is why that goal is important. So it's not just about, setting a numerical goal, but having an understanding, as we talked about, in terms of relevance, why that goal is important to that individual. And you can then draw your solutions and the plans that you put together back to connect to the relevance and the importance of why they're motivated to achieve that goal. Everyone's unique. We have different ways in which we want to engage in physical activity. And that is really the beauty of talking about leisure time physical activity, is there's so many different things that we can do to move our bodies. So sometimes it can be helpful to talk about any sort of activities that they're curious in exploring. Sometimes it's challenging to talk about the activities that folks did in the past. And so really sort of is up to you to gauge, what's appropriate to have in that conversation. But there are also preferences around whether people like to exercise or be physically active with other people, if they like to be out in the outdoors. So important to ask just generally to start with that question is, what is it that you have enjoyed in the past or currently enjoy, you're curious about? Are there ways in which you'd like to be physically active? And then you can start to ask some more specific questions, but always start with those broad questions to start and let your client lead the direction from there. So another way to think about preferences is we have this activity ramp, and I like to think of it as moving it from everyday active to accessible activities through to adapted sports. So more unstructured, free form activities to more structured forms of activity that also incorporate some level of competition. So to give some examples of that, for everyday activity, those are the things that they can be small changes in our day-to-day lives and just what we do on the regular. So it could be that we use some more active transportation to school or work, or to run any of the errands that we have to do. So instead of driving, if there's the opportunity to walk or wheel, if that's appropriate. I like the little trick to sometimes, if we're watching TV or we're waiting for the bus, you've got some free time, always having that resistance band on hand. So we can do, all different types of exercise with resistance band while we're either filling time or doing something else. And even just sort of these everyday activities that might already be a part of our lives, like taking the dog out for a walk or a wheel, parking a little bit further from your destination, playing or having dance parties with kids. So really kind of not as structured, thinking about how we lean into some of the things that we already do in our day-to-day lives and making small tweaks to that so we can fit a little bit more movement into our day. It's a really nice place to start for someone who is apprehensive about starting to be physically active, or feeling like they're not sure if they have time to add in a full gym session, put on your special clothes and go to a special place. This is a nice way to integrate into just sort of everyday living. Moving up to our accessible activities, this is where we start to add a little bit more structure. So maybe this is starting to then go to the gym and you decide if you want to use any of these sorts of pieces of equipment and move beyond resistance bands to using things like free weights or cable pulleys, starting with other different types of aerobic activities, like hand cycling or swimming, using the arm ergometer, playing recreational sports, or other forms of recreational activities. And if your client is short on time, there's mounting evidence for using high intensity or even moderate to high intensity interval training, where we work through short periods of higher intensity work with small periods of rest, and we keep cycling through those. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to pass the time if we've chosen to do something like an arm ergometer. Instead of doing 30 minutes straight, we start to break that up into a smaller time frame, work a little bit harder, and go through this cyclical work rest ratio. So just some ideas there for some other accessible activities. And then at the end of our ramp here is moving towards adapted sport and competing. So the sport admittedly can be expensive, especially some adapted versions. So we've listed here some examples of some potentially low cost sports, depending on how you play them. And then also some that typically require some specialized equipment. This certainly isn't an exhaustive list. There are more and more sports being added to this list as the years progress, which is a really promising thing to see, but lots of different opportunities in which your clients can get involved in sport which I know SCI has a pretty good handle on. And resources. So if we come in with this great plan, and we start to put together and organize to have, have your clients use an exercise prescription that was maybe prescribed to them by a kinesiologist or their personal trainer. And then we come to, well, okay, where are we going to do this and with what equipment? And we realize we don't have access to a gym. We don't have any home equipment. How we participate is going to look very different, right? So we have to be realistic about what we have access to. So this can be a really great opportunity for, if you're not sure, to connect with the SCI info line about what sort of gyms might be available, if they are accessible, where we might access equipment, if there's any sort of funding assistance or support. So lots of other kind of moving pieces to consider that really is an important part about being realistically able to participate in goals. So thinking about what kind of access to resources we have is another consideration. So now we've got a plan, or at least a goal. We have an idea of what we have access to, what the things are that we would like to do. And so there's really great and an exciting picture that we've painted here. But the reality is we know that there are over 200 barriers to participating in physical activity for people with physical disabilities. So how can we address those, be aware of them, and think through some strategies and plans so when and if we do come across them, we have a way to either think through solutions and can work together to overcome them. So I always start with a general question about whether your client perceives or foresees anything getting in the way of your goal. So we sort of restate the goal and talk about if we could see any obstacles or things getting in the way. Most people have an idea, and we don't necessarily have to go through this idea of this model, but it can be helpful to think of this model here, the capability, opportunity, motivation, behavior model. If one, someone is not sure if barriers are going to get in the way, or two, you have someone who is coming back consistently, you've tried different things, tried addressing different barriers, and it's still not working. We're still having a hard time sticking to our exercise plan. Then it can be helpful to think a little bit more broader and go through a bit of a guided conversation that helps us understand, is it something that's related to capability about if they know about how to be physically active, or do they have the skills and ability to be physically active? Whether it might be a challenge related to opportunity. So that is whether they have the social support system around them or the resources, their physical environment that allows them to access any sorts of services or the ability to be physically active. And then the motivation. So is it that it's something that we want to do? Or is it sometimes that we forget? Sometimes we need some help with some prompts and reminders. So thinking through capability, opportunity, and motivation can help us to put into a bit of a framework the different barriers that might get in the way. So I'll pause here for a moment for a bit of a discussion. Okay, so now we're moving into our last section here around developing a plan. So we can look at behavior change techniques, some key resources, peers, looking at how we can adapt our equipment that we have around us, and if appropriate, developing an exercise prescription. So with respect to behavior change techniques, these are like the ingredients of what makes an intervention work. And so we've selected some common and effective behavior change techniques that have been shown to be effective for supporting behavior change, physical activity behavior change for people with spinal cord injury. So the first one is graded tasks, and graded tasks are basically, we had that conversation about the physical activity guidelines, and where do we start? So if we set goals that we can achieve, there's adequate challenge there, but they're achievable, we make small changes. It helps to develop this sense of mastery of recognizing, oh, well, I've done this before, so maybe I can do a little bit more. we start to develop this confidence, which can be particularly important for people who are, say, for example, experiencing pain, are fearful of exercise, are a little reluctant to get started. Setting these graded tasks can be really helpful. So these small achievable goals. Our SMART goal setting, I'll be brief here because I think many of us are very familiar with this. The key thing that I want to emphasize here is that not only are these goals attainable, like we talked about in those graded tasks, but they are of adequate challenge so that, our accomplishments aren't trivial. But also importantly is that those goals are relevant. So that comes back to that goal setting conversation around, why is this goal important to you? Is it, because you want to be strong, to make sure that you can maintain your independence to transfer, because you want to be able to play with your kids, all those really great examples for why we want to improve either our cardiorespiratory or our muscular fitness. And then bringing those goals into an action plan. So key difference with moving those goals into an action plan is we're specific about which days, what times, and where we're going to be physically active. And, maybe sometimes people also like to set for how long and at what intensity, but really importantly is we're defining here what it would actually look like in your schedule to add that physical activity or those goals, so that, maybe it's something that we plan into our phone or put on our physical calendar. And then we know, on Tuesdays, 8 a.m., I'm getting up and I'm doing my strength training exercises at home. For prompts and cues, I mentioned that sort of that reflective or an automatic motivation are important. And so automatic motivation is that piece there where sometimes we forget. So prompts and cues can be really helpful for that. I think we've all been there where we've had those good intentions to go to the gym, and then all of a sudden it's 7 o'clock. You're like, oh, shoot, I forgot. I was supposed to go to the gym this morning. So prompts and cues can be helpful. As I mentioned, setting those prompts into your phone. Maybe it's even, if you had plans to go to the gym in the morning, you set your exercise clothes next to the bed. Sometimes it can be helpful to put up sticky notes, just those little reminders that help us to remember, oh yeah, I meant to get going at this time. Another word I'd certainly put my chips down on is monitoring. So you can have your client themselves monitor how they're doing. Sometimes we use things like a fitness tracker, and a little bit of a disclaimer there. I think they're still working out, and maybe this will change over time, the accuracy to which these fitness trackers capture wheeling motion. But self-monitoring is one thing that we can do. Another thing is this accountability is this buzzword that I keep hearing all the time that I think, really holds an important piece of being accountable to someone else. And ultimately we want to be accountable to ourselves. But it's certainly been a really powerful motivator to say, oh, I know my coach, him and I are, we've had this conversation to set this goal and follow through with it, and I don't want to disappoint them. So even though that starts out as a bit of an extrinsic motivation, wanting to accomplish that goal for reasons other than just, simply for yourself and your own good, it is a nice place sometimes to start, and can feel good to know that someone is checking in on you. So checking in on how they're doing, setting up your next appointment and stating that we'll follow up on how you've been doing with your goal, having a set of outcomes that maybe we're measuring to see how we're progressing over time. And sometimes even just that email or that text or that call, just to check in to see how we're doing, can be really powerful. And then reward in that same sort of theme of that extrinsic motivation. Sometimes we just need a little bit of the carrot and the stick. So coming through with some helpful and healthy ideas and how we can reward ourselves, if we are meeting our goals. So it could be something like, getting something as simple as, a good job, verbal encouragement. But, maybe you organize a special outing or, a little bit of a retreat and relaxation. If you're meeting your goals, say at the end of the month, it can be a nice way to start. Okay, so that's behavior change techniques. In terms of our key resources, we've compiled a list of resources for you, and you can take a look at that in the training folder. And of course, the SCI BC info line, they've got lots of information there. Peers, I don't have to talk about that with you all. You are already the experts here. So we'll move on from that one. And then adapting common exercise equipment. Some of us are really fortunate to have access to, beautifully adapted gym spaces like Park in Vancouver, but not all of us, not everyone is. So looking at typical gym equipment that we would see at, a common community center, usually if I'm making a call to those spaces, I'm asking if they have pulleys. So if there's a space there with pulley equipment and there's enough open floor space for a chair, I'm looking to see if they have free weights or resistance bands, if they have medicine balls, if they have handles for anyone who might have difficulty with grip. Likewise, cuff weights can be a great supplement if someone has difficulty with grip. Boxing and dowels are nice examples of things that we can use in a gym space. That's a nice way to get some aerobic activity. And then we'll talk about advocacy in a second here, but if I ever have a gym space that asks me, what can we get in terms of maybe low cost equipment that can help make our spaces more accessible? Typically things that I'll recommend are things like active hands or wrist hooks to help supplement grip. Something like a neoprene waist binder for having difficulty with core control. And then the cheapest option to supplement grip are even tensor bandages, but they're, a lot harder to get in and out of without any sort of assistance, which can also be the case with those other grip assistants. And then other sorts of special equipment, there's lots of fancy equipment there. And I think, one of the biggest challenges that we hear is, how do we get aerobic exercise in? So there's certainly these specialized pieces of equipment, but as I mentioned, things like boxing, dancing, movement with a dowel, doing an online exercise class. These are all great forms of aerobic activity that's not just wheeling where, sometimes we already do enough wheeling in the day. We want to save that for our activities of daily living. But yeah, if we have access to specialized equipment, these can be great examples where you can do things like either continuous training or interval training. Now, I have this note here in advocacy where, I've just experienced time and time again that I think a lot of gym spaces, it's not that they don't want to be accessible. I hope that's not the intention. It's sometimes that they just don't know how, or they don't realize that their gym is accessible or is not accessible. So taking the time to advocate and even just calling and asking about whether or not a gym space is accessible. I've had that conversation opened up many times where following that conversation, we've had more of a discussion on what it would look like to have an accessible gym space. And then they've gone and bought equipment based on our conversations. So you just never know. And I like to come into this thinking that people come in with good intentions. We just need to support them in how to make their spaces more accessible. Okay, so the last thing here is around exercise prescription, if that's appropriate, which for spinal cord injury BC, we are not doing exercise prescription, so that's a good opportunity to refer out. Okay, so we'll take a pause here and continue our conversation.